Okay, so let's have a look at the history of ITIL. ITIL has been the de facto IT service management approach for well over 3 decades now. It started in about 1980. There are about 50 books at that time. Again, it's IT infrastructure library, so it is a collection of books. But the approach then was on how. How does IT deliver its services? There was a few updates, of course, but a major revision or major update in 2001 for version 2. There are about 7 books at this point, but we only really used 2 of them, as you can see on the slide there. Then we went to version 3, which was a major overhaul, and they started to look much more closely at why we delivered IT services, much more focused on the customer. They were then 5 phases or 5 life cycles or 5 publications: service strategy, service design, service transition, service operation, and continual service improvement. They updated a little bit in 2011 for the 2011 edition, just some small minor improvements, more customer focus. And then here we are in 2019 with the 4th edition, or ITIL 4 as it's currently called, which we're going to go through, of course, right now. So why a new edition? Well, we're in the age of digital transformation, you could say. New technology like cloud computing, artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data, Internet of Things. A rapid change in pace, you could say. Customers want things in a different way now. They want value as early as possible. So we also have an expansion or an improvement, a drive for new approaches like Agile, DevOps, and Lean thinking. These have been some of the major drivers for a new version. With Agile, there's much more of a customer focus, much more collaboration with the customer. And this is really why they put together this new approach. Service management has been around for a long time. Initially started in hospitality industries, particularly hotel and airlines. And then most other organizations realized they needed some form of service management, a way to manage and monitor their services. And of course, IT was no different. So here we have IT service management. What can ITIL do for you? Well, it can give you awareness of the possibilities, awareness of your challenges, help you ask better questions about your problems. What can it not do for you? Well, it can't give you all the answers. It's best practice applied to any type of organization, big, large, small, any type of industry with an IT department essentially as a service provider. It can't give you all the answers and it can't take all the responsibility for you. You have to do that. Let's take a look at IT service management in today's world. Nearly everything around us is IT enabled. We have mobile phones with us 24/7, our computers we have, our laptops, our television, our telephones, everything is internet enabled. Our cars. A Ford Fiesta apparently has more processing power than the computers that sent the space shuttle to the moon back in the 1960s. Parking systems, traffic light systems, all IT enabled. So IT enables business. It's a key competitive driver in an organization. It makes organizations stand out. If you think about some organizations wouldn't even exist if it wasn't for IT. Look at companies like Facebook, Microsoft, for example. So therefore, IT service management is a key strategic capability. It impacts and makes a difference to the bottom line and to an organization's survival. So what are we going to cover in this course? Well, we're going to start you off with some service management concepts and some definitions, and then we're going to introduce you to the ITIL Service Value System, the SVS, the foundational model on which all of ITIL is built. As part of that, we're going to go into some more detail around some other elements within the service value system, like the service value chain, the guiding principles. We're also going to touch on some of the areas as well around governance and continual improvement. Then we're going to look at the 4 dimensions of service management, our resources. And then we're going to look at the 7 guiding principles. Also, as part of the syllabus, we cover 15 of the ITIL practices. We don't call them processes anymore, practices. And we're going to cover particularly here just the definitions and just some key terms there. And then 7 of those practices we're going to cover in a bit more detail. So now let's talk about the exam. The part everybody dreads. It's not as bad as it seems. It's quite reasonably put together actually and quite achievable, very high pass rates. But you will have to do some study, of course, and we have a workbook you can study from. You have this material we're looking at now, of course, and you have some sample papers, some sample exams you can go through too. The exam itself is 1 hour. You do get extra time if you're a non-native English speaker. There are 40 questions, and out of those 40 questions, you'll need to pass with a 65% pass mark, which is 26 correct questions out of 40. They're classic multiple choice, an A, B, C, or D answer. You only need to answer or select one correct answer for each question. There's no negative marking either. All the exams now are online web proctored. So you'll do them through a particular portal. Again, we'll give all this information later, of course, but online, web proctored, and they are closed book. The service value system describes how all the components of an organization work together as a system to create value. It's one system, takes inputs, turns them into outputs. We're going to cover this as we go through the course. We have the practices, which are sets of organizational capabilities designed to perform the work. And we have continual improvement, which could be performed at all levels. In fact, recommended to be performed at all levels. In fact, ITL holds continual improvement at such high esteem that you'll actually find it in 3 different areas within ITL. It's an element of the service value system, it's an activity in the service value chain, and it's also a practice. So you could say that the service value chain are the activities we perform, and then they are supported by governance and the practices, and then those are all guided by the guiding principles and continual improvement. For a holistic approach to service management, we need to consider the 4 dimensions of service management, which are collectively considered when we're looking to create service in the form of products and service to our customers. You could consider these our resources. Okay, so we have 4 different main areas, and although they're numbered, they're in no particular order, just 4 things you'd have to consider as part of your resources to provide those services and products. We have organizations and people, we have information and technology, our partners and suppliers, and our value streams and processes. We're going to cover these in much more detail in a later section. But you also see there is a model around the outside of external factors, PESTLE. Again, PESTLE, things that you have to consider, of course, which could impact all of your different resources, but they're not actually covered in this syllabus. I may give you an example later in the course. Service management is defined as a set of organizational capabilities for enabling value for customers in the form of services. Now, notice I said enabling, not delivering. Bit of a change from the old terms. We co-enable or enable value through a relationship between a provider and a consumer. Now, those capabilities and creating and developing those capabilities requires that we understand a few things, like what's the nature of service? What is service? Who are our stakeholders? What do they think about service? How is value actually created for our stakeholders and for our customers? We need to know those important things. A service is a means of enabling value co-creation for our customers, allowing them to achieve the outcomes they want to achieve, but without them having to actually manage specific costs and risks, although there will be some costs and risks involved in a service. For example, let's say I'm starting a new company, I need a service desk. Well, I could buy a location or rent a location. I've got the costs, of course, involved in the purchase or the rent, the leasing. I have all the equipment or the tables and chairs, the decorations, the carpeting, the booths for acoustic control, all the equipment and peripherals, there's the tooling, there's the licensing. Then I've got the people I need to employ as well, whether they're full-time employees or through agencies, there are visas, healthcare. Then people go sick, for example, I've got to replace them, I've got to deal with all these kind of issues. Or I could purchase a service from a third party. They provide all of those for me. If someone goes sick, well, it's not my problem. We have a contract, right? It's their problem. Now, of course, that takes away certain costs and risks, specific costs and risks. I still need to pay for the service. So there are costs involved, but it should remove many of the other costs. It also reduces certain risks that I can't provide, perhaps, or I overblow things and provide a too big a service desk or not big enough. But it does involve other risks, like, for example, the service provider perhaps could go bankrupt and go out of business. Maybe the service provider doesn't perform to the level of contract. A service is based on one or more products. Products are created through a configuration of our organization's resources in terms of the organization and people, information and technology, partners and suppliers, and the value streams and processes. Products can be complex, and sometimes the customer doesn't see all of the product. We can decide the amount of the product they see, for example. An email as a product. They would see the front end, sure, but they don't see all the back end. They don't see the security behind it, the storage behind it, the network behind it. And service offerings can be made from one or more products. A service offering is a formal description of one or more services which has been designed to address the needs of a particular or target consumer group. Now, a service offering can contain three different things. Goods, sometimes. This is where ownership of something will be transferred to the consumer, and then they will take responsibility for it, like a mobile phone, for example. Access to the resources. So this is where ownership is not taken, but it could be something like granting access to the mobile network or to mobile storage or network storage, for example. And then finally, we have service actions. Service actions will be things like user support. And these, of course, will be agreed, or the levels of service and the types of service actions will be within an agreement with the customer. For a service offering to be utilized, there has to be a service relationship, which is a cooperation between a service provider and a service consumer. Now, that relationship will need to be managed. So we have service relationship management, which are the joint activities between both parties, the provider and the consumer, to continually co-create value for both parties based on agreed and available services. Now, that is important, that the joint activities, this is a relationship, it's two-way traffic. We often consider service management around what's the service provider going to do for the consumer. But there will be responsibilities and activities and actions that both parties must agree to for that co-creation of value. When services are delivered by a service provider, they create new resources or they modify existing resources for our consumers. For example, like maybe a training service will help improve the capabilities of a consumer, or a car hire company, when they hire the car to the consumer can then use it to visit their customers, and they utilizing that service then. So now a service consumer can utilize the resources it now has or it's now gained to address the needs of another target group, another target consumer group of theirs. Therefore, they become a service provider as well. Now let's take a look at value. And value is highly subjective, of course. Value has to be valuable to somebody. Now, that somebody or those somebodies will be our stakeholders. It's also based on perception and preferences as well. For example, let's just say hypothetically, I like white cars, I have a preference for white cars, and I have a perception that Japanese cars are not very reliable. Who knows where those perceptions and preferences came from, right? But if you try and sell me a red Honda, it's going to be a very difficult sell. Whereas if you try and sell me a white VW, obviously the sale will be much easier. And remember, value is co-created. So we must understand our stakeholders. We must understand their expectations and their preferences and their perceptions and try and manage them. So there's active collaboration between the provider and the consumer. Now, to give value some kind of understanding, in ITL we use the concept of when you're looking at value, there will be a weighing up of a couple of different parameters. So we'll have outcomes which are achieved, supported, you could say, and then certain risks and certain costs which are removed. On the other side of the scale, you have certain outcomes which are affected negatively and certain costs and certain risks which will be introduced. An output is a tangible or intangible delivery of an activity. What we actually do, what we deliver, you could say. And many companies, many people will focus too much on the actual deliverable, the output. For example, let's say we're building a service management tool. The tool itself that we deliver is the output. Outcomes is where we should be more focusing on. Outcomes is the result, you could say, the result of change when a stakeholder actually uses the output. That's what we should really be focusing on here. What is the customer going to use this service for? What are they trying to achieve with this service? Now, there may be certain situations, depending on the relationship you have between the provider and the consumer, where understanding the consumer or customer's needs and their outcomes might be difficult to understand. So then we'll have to work together. Particularly in internal IT departments, you'll find business relationship managers will regularly meet with customers to talk to them, to refine and understand their outcomes so that we can give a better outcome for them. Costs are the amount of money spent on a specific activity or resource. And there are two types of cost. Costs removed, which are obviously all the costs removed by the use of the service, and costs imposed, all the money we spend on the services themselves. For example, like a cost removed could be that new sales software reduces administration costs, or electronic tags in retail will reduce the loss because of theft. A risk is a possible event which could cause harm or loss, or just make it more difficult to achieve an objective. Just like with costs, there are two types of risk: risks which are removed and risks which are imposed. Risks which are removed from the service consumer could be things like the removal of a risk of the consumer's hardware failing, or maybe a lack of availability of staff. Risks imposed on the service consumer, well, that could be maybe the provider having a loss of business perhaps, or experiencing a service outage. Now, the service consumer can help us in removing risk or reducing risk by participating in the definition of what the outcomes and what the desires are, or their requirements, by clearly communicating their critical success factors, and also by just making sure that the service provider has the necessary resources. When we look at service value, we also consider the concepts of utility and warranty. Utility you could think of as the functional requirements, or functional performance might be a better way of saying it. Is performance supported? Are constraints removed? Is the service fit for purpose? And with warranty are assurances of how well it performs. We call this, or consider this, fit for use. So utility fit for purpose, warranty fit for use. And we consider four aspects, four practices in fact: availability, capacity, continuity, and security. So consider an email product as a service. The utility is it an email service? Can I send emails? Can I reconfigure my inbox? What does it look like? Is it easy to use? Does it look nice? Then with the non-functional requirements, the warranty, how well does it perform? Can the service provider promise the consumer a certain percentage of availability, like 99.95%? What about capacity? Can they send and receive large file size? What about the size of the inbox? What about continuity? Have they looked at risk management to try and avoid major outages and things? And if something does happen, if something major condition does happen, can they promise us, or can they promise the consumer, a minimum level of service for an agreed period of time, and then restore to full working order within an agreed period of time? And then security. Is the information safe? Has it got 128-bit or 256-bit encryption? Now, obviously, both of these are important, and you may have experienced services or even vehicles, for example, where you've seen a high utility, low warranty, or vice versa. But we like to obviously have a blend of those, a zone of balance, you could call it, for utility and warranty for our customers. The complexity of organizations will vary greatly. An organization could be a single person, a team, or a very complex organization. But they should be united by common objectives, relationships, and authorities. And of course, an organization could be a consumer or a provider, depending on the perspective which is being considered. The term service consumer is rather generic. So we have three individual roles within the service consumer role. We have the customer, we have the user, and we have the sponsor. The customer takes responsibility for use and also defines the requirements, responsible for the outcomes. The user uses the service, and the sponsor provides the funding, takes accountability for the funding, you could say. Now, these roles could be held by individuals, or they could be shared in certain situations. So for example, let's say there's a project or let's say a service, we're introducing a new service, like an HR service, a portal for HR, for all of our staff, a benefits portal. The CIO could be acting as the sponsor. The HR manager could be the customer who defines the requirements and takes responsibility for outcomes. Then all of the organization's staff, including the CIO and including the HR manager, will be considered users. The 4 dimensions support a holistic approach to service management, and they're collectively important and must all be considered in the efficient and effective delivery of services and the co-enablement of value for our customers. As you can see, there are 4 of them. We have our, we talked about these earlier as well. We have our organization and people. We have our information and technology, partners and suppliers, and we have our value streams and processes. We're going to go through those individually. But remember, we also have talked about products and services, and remember that you could consider the 4 dimensions our resources, and our products are made up out of a configuration of our resources, and then obviously services are made up of our 1 or more products. They're also constrained by external elements as well, and we use the PESTEL model to explain those. So imagine you're in a country where there's a new president who has been sworn into office, and there are political differences and unrest within your organization. That could affect people and information and everything else. So I'll just give you a brief analogy. Now, that president may introduce some kind of taxes which cause you some kind of economic issue. Maybe there are corporate taxes, social taxes, which cause the company problems, cause people issues, which could cause social unrest. Maybe there are economic problems with those people that cause them to go on strike, perhaps, as an example. Now, maybe around the same time, we have new technology which is brought into place, and we'd like to utilize that technology. But maybe because of new laws that are brought into play by the president, there are legal issues, and we cannot introduce the new technology in certain states or certain areas or different countries, perhaps. And maybe the reason we can't introduce the new technology, as well as the legal issues, maybe those are environmental issues. Or maybe the reason we're introducing new technology is because we want to be more economically responsible. First, let's consider the dimension organizations and people. In an organization, there has to be structure. We have functions with systems of authority. There is reporting lines, departments, managerial positions or levels of authority, like I say. There also, we have to consider roles and responsibilities of those people. They must be documented. There is also, do we have the right workforce? Does that workforce have the required capabilities? The right numbers, the right capacity of people? But that's all well and good, and of course we need those things. However, none of this will work without the right people. And this is where culture comes in. Culture is extremely important, and there are many ways to define it, but you could say it could be the collective values and beliefs and principles of an organization. This is led by the leaders of the organization. The leaders set the tone for the organization. They set the culture. So you need leaders, not just managers. And there's a clear difference between managers who lead people or push work to the people, and leaders who lead people and pull people towards an objective. So the right culture requires trust and transparency, good communication. And as organizations become more complex, great leadership is extremely important. Information and technology, clearly a major part of information technology service management. When looking at information, organizations have got to consider things like what information is being managed by the service, what kind of supporting information and knowledge is required for the service, how will our assets and information be managed, how will they be archived, how will they be disposed, how long are we going to keep this information for. In many organizations, in many situations, information and information management might actually be the primary means of value enablement. So huge huge area to consider. Some of the challenges that organizations are going to face in the current age will be particularly focused around security, regulations, legislation, particularly around the EU, GDPR, HIPAA, and Sarbanes-Oxley, to name a few. There are various technologies that support service management, including things like analytical tools, communication systems, automated testing and deployment tools. In the consideration of technology, well, there are many considerations. For example, does this new technology, or the concept of bringing in new technology, will it introduce compliance issues? Do we have the necessary skills to utilize this technology? Can we grow the technology, and add on to it? Are we able to add modules, for example, and expand it? Is there support? Are we able to maintain this technology for the future? As in, are we willing to take the risk of introducing new technology and that technology not being implemented or not being adopted? Or maybe old technology and then the risk of it becoming obsolete? Yes, I think the big consideration for all organization, the technology, there's a lot of money in technology. So well-rounded, well-thought-out decisions, strategic decisions, like does this technology align with our strategy, need to be considered. Every organization depends on suppliers and partners to help them and assist them in the delivery of services. Those kind of relationships can vary dramatically. They could be goods suppliers with formal contracts, all the way up to partnerships with very flexible arrangements. And partners and suppliers can impact every element of service management and every element of the service value system. So it's very important to have some form of supplier policy to help us choose approved suppliers. Maybe people we've used before, people who are trusted. Remember, we're using suppliers really to reduce risk, in a sense. A risk that we can't provide something, we don't have the skills or the time or the money. So we then outsource that to someone else. But of course, it introduces the risk that maybe they can't actually deliver what they've said. So we don't want our suppliers to damage our reputation, rather enhance that reputation. In the situations where you're dealing with multiple suppliers, there's a concept of SIAM, or supplier integration and management, which is an approach which you might consider looking at to help you utilize and manage the performance of multiple suppliers with multiple contracts. A value chain is a series of steps that an organization undertakes to create products and services. Now, the activities within the value chain are generic, and they are the activities an organization undertakes to deliver services and products. But the patterns through the value chain, or the pathways through the value chain, depending on the type of service and situation we're experiencing and delivering, we consider those value streams. A process is a set of interrelated, interconnected activities that take inputs and transform them into outputs. Now, in the context of value streams, processes are considered to be more detailed. They define the sequence and the steps of the activities and the details between them. So the procedures, the work explanations, the work instructions, and also the roles and responsibilities for carrying out that work.